but some of you are new. And Cantigny is the historic home of Colonel Robert R. McCormick, our benefactor, who was the longtime owner, editor, and publisher of the Chicago Tribune. And second only to the Tribune in his heart was his service with the 1st Division of the United States Army in World War I. And he was absolutely devoted to his comrades and to veterans generally after his service therein for the rest of his life. And when he passed away, he left millions of dollars that he had made as an entrepreneurial head of the Chicago Tribune Company to found what is now our parent organization, the Robert R. McCormick Foundation of Chicago, a major philanthropy. If you aren't familiar with it, you should check it out. And he left Cantigny Park as a public park for the people of Illinois. And those of you who have come down from Wisconsin or over from Indiana are also very welcome. We're delighted to have you here as well. And so that's how, and one of the things the Colonel was interested in was the preservation of the legacy and history of the 1st Division in which he had served. And that was fortuitous because the 1st Division is America's oldest division. It's been on continuous active duty since 1917 and is currently deployed in Afghanistan as headquarters of Regional Command East. Its 4th Brigade is fighting just east of Kabul. And so not a day of our history has passed since World War I that we have not been served by the men and women of the 1st Infantry Division. We're proud to tell their story here. Tonight's speaker is going to talk about armor, and there has been armor in the 1st Infantry Division, and so we'll hear about that tonight. We're fortunate to have with us the author of On Armor, Bruce Goodman. Bruce is currently the Case Methods Chair at the Marine Corps University in Quantico, Virginia. Now, what's that? It'll make more sense once they name it. He's working on that. It could be, you know, like the like the Bradley Chair. Yeah, exactly. But what his job is as a historian is to encourage all of the officer training that takes place at the Marine Corps University to use the case methods style of teaching, analytical, present a scenario and have people figure it out and make the solutions themselves. And our discussion over dinner on that technique was just really fascinating. He has many claims to fame, a BA from Yale, a PhD from Oxford, and a PFC from Parris Island of the United States Marine Corps, the title of which I think he might be most proud. He has written 6 major books, including on armor, hundreds of articles. He has been the Omer Bradley, has held the Omer Bradley Chair of Military History at the U.S. Army War College. And so it's a great personal pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker on armor, Dr. Bruce Goodman.
Well, good evening. I'd like you to start by being very, very quiet. Being as quiet as you can be, and listen very carefully. Because if you're very, very quiet, and you listen very carefully, you can hear the plaintive, sorry, not plaintiff groaning, that's from the courthouse, the plaintive groaning. The lawyer laughed there, right? Thank you. Of the bookshelves in the libraries, in the bookstores, in private homes, and the bookshelves are moaning under the weight of books about tanks. So why, I would ask, would somebody write yet another book about tanks? There are plenty of wonderful books out there. So what I'd like to do is pick somebody from the audience, because I do teach the case method, very interactive, and I go up to people and I say, "Sir, what's your plan?" Or sometimes I ask what I call Marvin Gaye's question, "Sir, what's going on?" Okay. So, sir, tell me, why would, given all these wonderful books about tanks out there, why would I write another? You don't know. Sir, why would I write another book? Why write another book about armor? This is wonderful literature out there. Yep, extra research, extra research. I spend a lot of time in archives. I prefer the ones in Paris for obvious reasons. The chow's better, right? Yeah, a lot of stuff has come out of the archives. There's a tendency of any literature to feed upon itself, and you end up, rather than having 100 books, you have the same book 100 times. So certainly there's some fresh research, fresh archival research in the book. Why, sir, why do we need another book on armor?
Because it would read the definitive study.
The definitive study, oh my goodness, you've been talking to my mom, right? It's like you really have a lot of confidence, but I really appreciate that. I'm going to write Mom tonight and say, hey! Actually, it isn't the definitive study. I don't make that claim. Every once in a while they say, Theodore Roosevelt wrote the definitive study on the Naval War of 1812, and no one's going to ever do anything better. I hope that someone will exceed me on this book. It's not the definitive study. With that in mind, sir, why write another book on armor? Ego, okay. You've been talking to my shrink, actually. You've been talking to my mom, you've been talking to my shrink. No. Okay. Sir, why write another book about our armor? We need another one. Why do we need another one? You don't like Kindles. Okay, so because you want a nice, hefty, old-fashioned. Okay, we need more books. Never have enough books. Sir, why write another book about armor?
Oh, I would. When I was off the Air Force.
Oh, okay. Sir, tell me, why another book on armor? Is it needed?
Absolutely. Foundation of our society.
Foundation of our society. Okay, but there's 100 other books on the subject. Actually, thousands of them.
That in the infantry.
And the infantry. Okay. Okay, not many books in the infantry. I mean, if you actually go to the Library of Congress and you type in infantry, you're not going to get much in terms of overall studies. You get lots of stuff on armor and very little on artillery. Now, I wrote a book on infantry and I wrote a book on artillery for those very reasons. But why write a book on armor? There's plenty of stuff out there, sir.
Same reason why.
It's to be part of a series.
Because subjects.
The subject's neat, but again, there's all these other neat books on the subject. Why should I write this other book? Innovation. Okay, well, yes, no, it's interesting that we live in an age, if you go to your military bookstore, or you go to a military publisher and say, I want to write a military book, and they say, write something about counterinsurgency. Right? That's the whole rage in military publishing, right? And we're forgetting this whole other phenomenon of conventional warfare. Yeah, right. Because counterinsurgency is so much the rage. In fact, the other day I was watching the Food Channel, and they had a show about eating soup with a knife. Counterinsurgency joke. Never mind. Next one will be better, I promise. So, why did I write this book? The reason is that the bulk of the literature on armor is what some people would call Whig history. That's Whig, W-H-I-G. Now, if you do 17th century Irish history, 18th century English history, or 19th century American history, you'll learn about the Whigs. Right? Abraham Lincoln, I'm here in Illinois, I've got an obligatory Lincoln reference, right? He was his first political party, he was a Whig, right? I mean, remember? No, nobody remembers. But you've read about Abe Lincoln and the Whig Party. But in this context, what is Whig history? Well, the great proponent of Whig history, the great practitioner of this art, was a man named Thomas Babington Macaulay. He's a British historian. He wrote a history of Britain. He was writing in the 19th century, and his argument that all these things that happened, the Magna Carta, the English Civil War, Cromwell, all these events in British history served to create this wonderful thing that was Victorian Britain. All that happened in the past brought us to the present, and all that was necessary. And that all these people in history Simon de Montfort, right? There's actually, Simon de Montfort was this Norman warlord, didn't even speak English, spoke French, right? But yet we have, thanks to Macaulay, we have a picture of him in our House of Representatives as this great exponent of parliamentary democracy. There's also a picture of him, a statue of him in the House of Parliament in Britain. And the idea is that Simon de Montfort, this medieval Norman French-speaking baron, somehow is the father of our current democracy, or at least Victorian parliamentary democracy. And then Oliver Cromwell. Right? And that's why if you go to Britain, go to the House of Parliaments, there is a statue of Oliver Cromwell in front of the House of Parliament, even though Oliver Cromwell is the only man who ever walked into Parliament with armed men and shut it down. He was the Pinochet of Britain. And yet we make him a hero. Why? Because of Whig history. This idea that everything that happened before is part of this story of progress. And the story of progress is a straight line. And that's the problem with our literature on armor. The idea is that everything that happened from the first tank that crossed no man's land in World War I, all of that was part of this development that culminates in Desert Storm. And when I grew up with this literature, I embraced it, and then when I finished on artillery, my version of an infantry, I said, what's next? The obvious answer was on armor. I started doing the research, and the story was very, very different. And there are all these gaps in our narrative. So I'll ask you a question, another question, very interactive talk. Again, the case method, that's part of what I'm promoting here. At the end of World War I, which country has the biggest tank fleet in the world? Sir? Sir? France. France, you read the book. No. Oh, okay. Oh, good, okay. It's France. It's not Britain. One of our problems with the literature about tanks, particularly early literature, is it's very British. And it has British, the British blinders on. And the British, and the one thing that constantly shocks me about the British is that the British can get to France by swimming 20 miles or going under the tunnel now or taking a very short flight or a ferry, and yet they don't do it. And the British know less about France than we do. So most of British military history has very little about the French, and so we never pick up on or very few of us pick up on the fact that at the end of World War I, even though the British claim invention of the tank, it's the French who are the biggest tank fleet. In fact, we have a Renault FT tank out there in our tank park if you want to walk around. Actually, not tonight. You have to go home tonight after the talk. Park is closed, but if you want to look at that. The French have a lot of tanks. They also have a very, very large armored car fleet. Okay. At the start of World War II, which country has the biggest tank fleet? Germany. Who says Germany? Who says Soviets? Soviets. Okay, why the Soviets? Yeah, the Soviets are the biggest tank fleet at the start of World War II. Why is that the minority opinion? Because at the end of World War II, we got all of the German generals, and they wrote their memoirs. And in a period when a lot of American historians didn't want to do military history, and a lot of Americans thought history was bunk, the publishers were publishing these memoirs of the German officers. So we have a view of armor development that's not only very British, but also very disproportionately German. So we're missing a big part of the story. And we're also missing a big part of the German story because, ironically, the German memoirs are usually funneled through a British lens. And that lens is a man named Basil Henry Little Hart. And Basil Henry Little Hart was a journalist. Any journalists here? No journalists at all. My dad was a journalist. I grew up both my folks actually worked in journalism. So it's a world I know very well. And even though really good journalists are different, the easiest story for a journalist to write is a melodrama. Right? You've got the hero in the white hat, you got the villain in the black hat with the mustache that curls and, right, ties young ladies to railway taxis. So there's no question about who the good guy, who the bad guy is. That's the easiest type of story to write. And these German memoirs are full of that story, particularly the memoirs of Heinz Guderian. And Heinz Guderian tells this wonderful, and this is a Whig tale too, because the Whig history, you have the villains and you have the heroes. And Heinz Guderian tells us this wonderful tale of himself. Who said who accused me of being an egotist? Right? I may or may not be, but Heinz Guderian certainly was. And his tale is, I'm young Heinz Guderian. I watched the British experience in the First World War. Notice he doesn't mention the French experience. And I was filled with this vision of the tank and the Panzer Division. But there was this wicked old guy, Ludwig Beck, this Colonel Blimp character, who tried to keep me down. But I was brave and I was smart and, oh yeah, I used to hang out with Hitler. Oh, well, okay, well, nobody's perfect. I pushed my vision forward and I built these armored divisions despite the fact that Ludwig Beck, the chief of staff, was this horrible, horrible troglodyte and wanted to push us all back into the 19th century. And if you check that against the documents, you go to the German archives and look at the documents, you see something very interesting. First of all, Heinz Guderian doesn't start writing about tanks until 1938, several years after the tank divisions are formed. And you have all these orders signed by Ludwig Beck that's saying, okay, yeah, let's develop the armored force. And then you look further back and you say, yeah, there's this thing called the armored force, and they don't have tanks, but they have all these other elements of the Panzer Division. The anti-tank guns, the armored cars, the motorcycles. And so you have this very, very funny history that emerges from these documents of the Germans building armored divisions that have no tanks. How can you have an armored division without tanks? Well, they say, we're going to get tanks eventually. But we can't have them because of the Versailles Treaty, so we're going to work on building the nucleus of all these other elements. And that's another reason I wrote the book, is to give more weight to all of the handmaidens of the tank. All of these other things, whether they are armored vehicles or not. The tank does not exist by itself. Again, if my publisher even, right? Actually, my publisher was very good. Rather than putting a picture of a tank on armor, they put a picture of a Bradley fighting vehicle. That was very, very good. Because usually, if you go to your encyclopedia and it says armored division, what do you see? A picture of a tank. But most of the folks in an armored division are not in tanks. And in fact, a lot of your tanks aren't in armored divisions. It's another part of the story. So there's this whole part of the story that really doesn't get told very well. And I wanted it to at least give readers some reminder of that. Another purpose of the book. Another question for you. Who invents the tank, sir? Who invented the tank? Da Vinci. We got Da Vinci, way back when. Modern tank. A guy who knew his suspensions, right? Okay, Christie, but really in the 1920s, 1930s, and really increases the speed of tanks because of his suspensions. Sir. The Brits. Who invented the tank? The Americans. How do the Americans invent the tank?
He had to sit outside.
Well, certainly the basis of the tank is American. It's the Holt tractor, right? And the Holt tractor is actually developed in the San Joaquin Valley in California because of the soil conditions there. And this Holt tractor, some French farmers in Tunisia buy some because it's a very similar type of device, very similar soils to Southern California, and then these farmers have these tractors with the Caterpillar treads, and the French at the start of the war, and the French and the British, they go to the farmers saying, "Hey, we need to pull our heavy artillery. We'll use these tractors," and then people start saying, "Hey, what if we start armoring these things?" But well before we start armoring tractors, or they start armoring tractors, people are building armored cars. Now, who invents the armored car? Armored car. Yeah, who invented the armored car? The French. It's the French, of course. Well, actually, I don't know. Yes. 1903, built for Russia. Yes. That's an early purpose-built armored car. But what does it take to make an armored car? Imagine your touring cars from the first decade of the 20th century, right? Like a Rolls Royce. They're grossly overpowered because they're toys. So you get this little car with this great big engine, and then something happens, and somebody says, let's armor this. And who knows armor plate in the early part of the 20th century? Sailors. The world of battleships. One of the big contributors towards armor in the First World War is the surplus of sailors. Because at the end of the 19th century, the navies of Europe adopt a military-style structure in terms of their personnel systems. Right? So prior to in the 19th century, most navies is day on, stay on. The navies are full of really old sailors, professional mariners, people who live their lives on the sea. And they're often the sons of sailors recruited from sailors, whether forcibly or not. Right? And then in the end of the 19th century, the navies of the industrialized world say, no, we're going to adopt a military-style system with reservists. So you join for 4 or 5 years, 3 years, 2 years, short enlistment, join the Navy, learn to trade. Right? But then you're a reservist. So at the start of World War I, the navies produce all these spare people they don't know what to do with. You have all these reservists, don't have enough ships for them. Now the shipyards are full of all sorts of interesting things. Armor plate, people who know how to work machinery, people who know how to handle boilerplate and not just boilerplate, but armored plate. Lots of spare machine guns. Because navies actually adopt the machine gun far sooner than armies because they're concerned about torpedo boats. They want to have secondary armament on their various ships and useful for dealing with, Somali pirates. Some things never change, right? And you got these machine guns, and you got these small caliber guns, 37 millimeter, 57 millimeter, things like that, and they're all just hanging out in these navy yards. And here comes this rich, volunteer reserve officer, okay, and he's a yachtsman probably, and driving his Rolls Royce. And he says, "Hey, Chief, how about throwing some armor on that thing? And that machine gun? Let's cumshaw that." You don't even know the word cumshaw? It's a verb. It's an unofficial transfer between one government agency and another. It's an old Marine Corps term. I love Army logistics. Such a good logistical system. It supports 2 services. It's the old joke from World War II. And this happens over and over again. I mean, yes, there are companies that are purpose-building armored cars, Many of them, ironically, for the purpose of shooting down balloons. Tell me. Yes. Yes, 1870, right, in the Siege of Paris, yes, the French used balloons. Yes. Yes, yes. 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 Armor. Yes. Yes. Yes.
And they choose two. There's not both numbers, 4 or 5 of the two models. And they were first only artillery. Armored cars, no, different thing. Because they've been installing machine guns.
Yes.
And they've been built mostly by French or Russia.
Yes.
The Russian government on the Caucasus. Like today.
Right. Right. So here, yeah, no, and this is good, and it's a story that doesn't come into my book until 1916, and the point here is that, again, this is not the definitive work. I don't have all these stories together, and I wish I knew that story before I wrote the book. Wish I would have met you 10 years ago, but that story about how people are combining, with or without success, relatively modest caliber guns, motor vehicles, and armor. Those three elements are there. And now those balloon guns, they do show up in the book in 1916 in a story about the Romanian campaign. So it's there in the book, but I don't have a story of their origin. The book has a story of, again, perhaps a slightly more romantic story of these naval reservists. Happens in Britain, happens in France, happens in Tahiti, of all places. You know, you're in Tahiti, World War I breaks up your French territory, you're living this wonderful sort of Paul Gauguin existence in Tahiti, right? You're going, oh yeah, I pulled a good assignment, right? I got Tahiti, you're a French soldier, and all of a sudden you realize, okay, we've got coal, there's no French ships around, and there are all these German ships that want to come to Tahiti and take the coal so they can go out and create mayhem on the high seas. What now, Lieutenant? What do you do? You're that French naval officer, actually. You're on shore duty in Tahiti. And all of a sudden you go from really sweet shore duty to, I got a problem. I got to keep this coal out of the hands of the Germans. What do you do? Lieutenant, mon lieutenant, what do you do? What's your plan? Mine the harbor. Mine the harbor. Good plan. Mon lieutenant, what do you do? The Germans are coming. They want your coal. You're defending Tahiti. Armor up your touring car. Actually, armor up your trucks. Right? What do you got? You got some trucks, and they're getting a little overpowered, which is a good thing. You've got all these small caliber pieces, machine guns and pom-poms and this is things that you might put on what we'd later call a PT boat. Right? Little 37 millimeter guns and what have you. And these are sort of the afterthoughts of the arsenals. Right? You read your books on the First World War artillery, there's all these wonderful things, it's all about Big Bertha, 420 millimeter mortar. So I always felt for the guy who carried the base plate for that one. Mortar, base plate. Anyway, moving back. Okay. So so they're in Tahiti, of all places, they invent the armored car. Now, the idea is out there already. And my point here is what you're dealing with is simultaneous invention. It's not rocket science. It's tinkering. You take the little armored plate, you take a vehicle, and sometimes, it doesn't work because the armor is too heavy. And you say, okay, well, I'll only armor a little bit. But the idea is abroad. So trying to figure out who invented this thing is a very hard thing. And no one's bothering to patent these things because there's no science or even engineering here. I mean, it's really simply a matter of simple application. It's Lego work. I'm exaggerating a bit, but putting it together. Now the question is, why doesn't somebody think about taking these Holt tractors, which are in production in America, in Southern California, in Tunisia. The French army has gotten some of them to move their really heavy guns. The British army has gotten a few. Why not simply take one of these tractors and do to it what you did to an armored car? Why don't folks do that? Because the great mystery is that they don't. It's been done. It's been tried because of the Earhart experience. Yes.
Probably first use of the land.
Yes, in South Africa. So in the Boer War, yes, right. That the. Oh yes. The armored train is another idea here. Yeah, and we're probably not exclusively American. In the early 20th century, logistics is all about trains. Armies advance along the rail line. What's the history of the Boer War? You go up the rail line. History of the British expedition in the Sudan, you go down the river because you have no rail line. In South Africa, what they're doing is they're getting these great big steam engines, and they say, this land is so flat, maybe we can have a railroad without rails, have a little more mobility. And it works pretty well. Not terribly mobile, and you need lots of water and coal and things like that. But the armored car system is working. So Tahiti is defended. In Belgium, there is a Belgian armored car unit. One could argue that one of the most forward-thinking armies in the world in 1914 is that of Belgium. And how many of you have ever met a Belgian military historian? Not many of them. But Belgium is experimenting with lots of interesting things because they're in a unique situation. They have one of the world's best road networks. They've got nice paved roads, small country. They have fortresses, and their problem is how do you connect these fortresses? So they start thinking about bicycles. They start thinking about armored cars. So they start building purpose-built, the Minervas, the purpose-built armored cars. And there is this period of time at the start of World War I on the Western Front where the armies are still moving, things are still fluid, the trench warfare is not set in yet, and Belgium is no man's land. And there is this guerrilla war, this armored guerrilla war with Belgian purpose-built armored cars and British touring cars, the Rolls Royces, with the armored plate, the homemade armored plate, with these wonderfully colorful reserve officers in charge. And they're raiding back and forth, and they're fighting the German cavalry and what have you. But then trench warfare sets in, and where do the Belgians send their armored cars? To Russia. They send them to Russia. Because what do you have in Russia? You've got lots of flat land, and you have a warfare that's much more mobile. But still we have the problem. Now we have trench warfare setting in. Why doesn't somebody say, take these Holt tractors, they're off the shelf technology. All you need to do is, call up your Holt dealer and say, send me some tractors. We still got all the stuff laying around the Navy yards. We still have lots of unemployed or some underemployed naval reservists. Why not do that? Why is that? The Holt tractors, yes. Crossing the trenches, okay. Yes. 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 Right, because you have two things are going on with trench crossing. One is that in Belgium, where a lot of World War I is happening, you've got canals, lots of canals, and very wide canals. The second thing is that even though a lot of trenches are, you imagine a trench, the trenches we see in photographs are very narrow. The trenches that are actually built are much, much wider. And that is to minimize the shell trap phenomenon. And so you've got these really wide trenches. So it's one thing, yes, you can go over the barbed wire, you can cross no man's land, but how do you cross the trench? What's the real problem? The shell holes. The shell holes. Right. Okay, so then the question is, what do you do? How do you apply this idea? Does it even make sense of combining an internal combustion engine with armor and these small caliber weapons? How do you make it bigger? Right? The Landship. In fact, I had a wonderful couple of rainy days in London at the King's College Archive, King's College London Archive, the Little Heart Archive, and I read the minutes of the Landships Committee, chaired by Winston Churchill. Right? And Winston Churchill, even though he's a former Army officer, is in his heart a Navy guy. Right? He loves ships. And his plan is, well, let's not make a Caterpillar tractor version of an armored car. Let's make a land cruiser. He's using the term cruiser in the naval sense, not in the Dodge PT Cruiser sense, but in the, Salem class cruiser sense. The Salem class hasn't been invented yet, and he's talking about a juggernaut that carries 4 4-inch guns. That's 4 100-millimeter guns. Okay. Now, tanks don't start carrying 100-millimeter guns till the 1950s as a rule. He wants to put 4 of them. He's got this vision. And it takes about all of 1915 for the British to figure out, well, it's probably a little too big, and they go smaller and smaller and smaller, and then get that rhomboid tank that we're all familiar with, that iconic World War I British tank. So it's sort of interesting that the armored car comes together very, very quickly. So quickly that it's very hard to determine the inventor. But the tank itself, the Caterpillar tread tank, takes much longer because of this issue of of size. Now, while this is going on, the French are doing the same thing. And some French authors argue that the French are doing this first, but it's very much a parallel process. And yes, if this was a legal rush to get a patent, the British would probably win the case. But the French are working in parallel, and they're thinking a little bit differently. They don't have this gargantuan landships idea. They have this idea that comes from a very interesting guy named Persin, Alexandre Persin. And Persin is somebody who very few Americans have heard of, but he has a big effect on our military vocabulary. He's the man who invents the term fire support. Right? Go through the records of the rebellion, the official records of the Civil War, you will not see the word fire support once. Alexandre Persin invents the idea of fire support because he says, because we have this wonderful cannon, the French 75, with its shield, it can fire very quickly, produce a great suppressive effect, and because of its shield can go very close to the enemy. And no longer will artillery prepare attacks, it will support them. So while the infantry are attacking, the cannon will fire. And this idea of assault artillery starts off with this vision of French soldiers pushing this cannon by hand forward. Now, obviously, there's some problems with this because this thing weighs, a ton. It literally weighs a ton, right? So, and then you have the problem with shell holes and terrain and barbed wire and things like that. But what the French start thinking of is let's build our tank around this gun. Not to think of it as a naval ship or as a armored car on pillars, but to think of it as a life support system for this gun. And that is the first French tank coming out of the factory at Saint-Chamond, where a lot of the people who had worked in the French 75, same people, on that artillery piece, had taken up jobs after leaving the French army. So the French are starting with a very, very different point of view. These, however, do not work particularly well. They're useful. There's some successful attacks. But at the end of the First World War, the French end up with a weapon that's essentially a little more than a Holt tractor that's been armored with a machine gun on it. That's the Renault FT tank that we have out there in the park. So one of the mysteries of armor development is, again, why doesn't it follow the same pattern as the armored car? Now, once World War I is over, what's the future of the tank? World War I, we're told, is the war to end all wars. A lot of people believe that. The French have their empire in North Africa. If you doubt that, watch a Gary Cooper movie. The British have their still holding on to their empire, and they have a new empire in the Middle East. So what role does a tank play in that? Who is looking at the tank as the way of the future? Now, if you read the Whig history, this Anglo-Saxon, this British history, the horrible Colonel Blimps with their mustaches, they all have mustaches. The villains in the story all have mustaches. Say, oh, no more tanks. We're going to cut the tank cord down to the bone. We're going to go back to cavalry because cavalry can garrison the empire and what have you. That's absolute nonsense. If you look at the actual numbers, the tank corps does very, very well in the post-war cuts. And so, in fact, in Iraq, in Mesopotamia, the British have this vision that we're going to control the country with armored cars and aircraft. And in India, where the problem is the northwest frontier, How do you defend the good bottomland of the Indus Valley? Right? Indus is a Hindustani word. It means Mississippi. Right? It's the breadbasket of India. And up in the hills, you've got the crazy Afghans, and every once in a while they come down and create hate and discontent. And the problem with the British Army in India is how do you keep the Afghans in line? Well, either you have a lot of infantry up in those hill forts, you recruit local people, but in 1919 they mutinied, so a little problem there. How about some tanks? And what kind of tanks? Light tanks, a lot like those French FT tanks, basically a whole tractor or a similar vehicle, a little bit of armor, machine gun on top. Tanks do very, very well in the interwar period. And who are the people who love the tanks most of all? The Russians. Why?
Not only Russia, most Eastern European countries
Why is that?
bordering with Russia
Yes.
after revolution.
Right.
Story of first 20 years after different wars. Hopefully Russia learned a lot from army work, Polish war, Poles doesn't have many tanks.
And what kind of tanks are the Poles using? French tanks. Yeah. And they're using these Renault FT, which are small, reliable, handy, a little tractor with a machine gun on it, a little bit of armor. But that's the tank of the future from the point of view of the Europeans. So this is a weapon that's... Who's thinking differently? The French. Yes.
Building huge tanks,
Yes. Right. Yes. Yes. And you certainly have that. But what are if you go to a French tank unit in Algeria or France, right, or FTs, or you go to a Polish tank unit in 1919, 1920, FTs, right, yes, right, and if you go to India or Mesopotamia, you've got either armored cars or light tanks. The kind of tank we see here, this 40, 50, 60-ton behemoth, that's still on the drawing boards. 20s and 30s is the era of the light tank, and very much the French light tank. Sir?
So was driving up gun size the answer? Gun size.
Well, here is the paradox. Here's the paradox. The only tank in this period, up to really the 1930s, to be built around a gun is that first French tank, the Saint-Chamond. Again, built by the gun engineers, the gun designers, the same people who brought you the French 75. Starting in the 1930s, or throughout this period, the weaponry is an afterthought. And this, I think, is in keeping with the naval origins of the tank. It's what do you arm your tank with? Whatever's hanging around at the Navy Yard. Right? This old naval ordnance. That's the last. Your first consideration. I need an engine. I need some means of movement. I got to get across those trenches. And the second is armor. The gun is third. So you don't have purpose-built tank guns at this time. It's whatever is being developed for something else. There's already there. And oh, by the way, a lot of the personnel are still these naval reservists, both in Britain and in France. So if you look at the careers of the tank pioneers, they become soldiers. But if you open up their service record books, oh yeah, these guys start out in the Navy. And that's why you have such customs like name the tank as if it were a ship, and use all this naval terminology. JD, there, you're a tanker, right? You talk like a sailor, sir, right? When you talk about your tank, you're talking like it's like a ship, right? I mean, don't say port and starboard, but everything but. Right? The first attempt to build a tank around the gun doesn't work very well. And then one country, one army, which sees the tank as the future. Because in the 20s and 30s, there's a lot of debate about what tanks are good for. And the essence, this is the simple version of the debate is a tank there to support the infantry? Is it the handmaiden of the infantry? Does it help the infantry get forward? Or do you put it separately in separate formations and use it for maneuver? And there also is a variance of that, and the book goes into that in great detail. But the Russian solution to that, what's the Russian solution?
How to say?
The Russian solution is everything.
Should be the German solution.
Well, no, the Russian solution?
German.
The Russian solution? Yeah,
After First World War,
right.
both armored Germany
Yes.
going to Russia.
Oh, yes, yes, yes,
Hard to say who developed.
yes. And everybody in the 20s and 30s is learning from each other. They're watching each other closely. The Germans model a lot of their stuff from the British. And they also model a lot of their stuff from the French. You won't see that in the Panzer General memoirs, but you will see that in the documents. It's the Russians who say, first of all, we want the tanks for everything. We don't want to choose between infantry support and grand maneuver, tank battalions for the infantry divisions or armored divisions. We want both. And part of that, the whole point of the Soviet Union, right, is to create this huge mechanical modern army that will conquer Europe and create the great proletarian revolution everywhere in Europe, right? That's the whole point. And it's the Soviets who also say, let's not make the gun an afterthought. Let's put the biggest gun we can in our tanks. Right? So the Soviets start this gun race with tanks that it takes the rest of the world to catch up with. The next people to pick up on the gun race are the Americans, is us. And we do that by mistake. One of the great privileges of my life is when I was working as a case writer at the Kennedy School of Government, I went down to see General Wiedemeyer. Remember General Wiedemeyer, who was, among other things, Chiang Kai-shek's chief of staff? And he graciously received me, and we talked about his experience. And General Wiedemeyer was one of the first or the two American officers who went to the German Kriegsakademie in 1937-38. And there at the Kriegsakademie, the Germans did an exercise in which all the tanks had 75 millimeter guns. And he writes his report back about this exercise with all the tanks having 75 millimeter guns. Now, as a matter of fact, at this point in time, about 2% of the German tanks have 75 millimeter guns. The rest have 37 or smaller. Most, in fact, just have machine guns. But folks in the War Department look at then Captain Wiedemeyer's report and say, oh yeah, we need a 75. So we put a 75 on the Sherman. Well, first on the Lee Grant, then on the Sherman. Largely on the strength of this report. Also, Time magazine reports this in 1940, trying to explain the defeat of France in 1940. So America's next. It takes Britain a while. In fact, have you ever seen a Canadian Ram tank? Canadian Ram tank is a Canadian Sherman. Mechanically, it's a Sherman because the Canadian auto industry is the same as the U.S. auto industry, same parts. But it mounts a 2-pounder, a 40 millimeter piece. It's like a Sherman with a little tiny gun. It looks bizarre to American eyes. The British are really the last to figure out we need to put a big gun on there. And then they go nuts. And then you get the Sherman Fireflies and Centurions and things like that. So, I can't take you, again, this is not a definitive history. What this book is a companion to the existing literature. And I've critiqued the literature, I've condemned it as Whig history. Much of it is Whig history. Whig history isn't useless. It just is in my view, too linear, too historicist, too Marxist, actually, in a sense. But you need the rest of the story. You need those Paul Harvey moments. And that's what I try to do with the book. So at this point, what I'd like to do is open up to questions. Sir? I didn't. That's a rich subject. The Arnhem campaign obviously comes to mind. You mean airborne, like the Sheridan tank and... not the cooperation between armor and airborne, but I do not touch upon that. And I also don't touch upon the amphibious role of tanks, which is to my eternal shame as a Marine. Okay, so sir. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Yeah. I have a question for you. Is it true that the Pershing tank, which came on later in the war, was first offered to the United States and Patton refused it and thought the Sherman was better because of maneuverability? I'll give you my experience.
Yes.
I'm a tank driver in an M5 Stuart tank. I landed in Normandy in D+15 with the 3rd Armored Division. And have you ever heard of Maurice Rose? I saw him 10 minutes before he got killed up near Paderborn.
Okay. So the question was about the M26 Pershing tank, which is a tank much more like this than the Sherman is. In a sense, almost the model, the model of the tanks that follow in the post-World War II period. I don't think Patton was alone. I think that everybody from Leslie McNair on downward preferred to have the Sherman, and not the heavily armored version of the Sherman, the basic Sherman, for reasons of simplicity. And that was really a production decision, as well as a decision about mobility. But remember, and in those days, if you go back to the records of what people like General McNair were thinking, their idea was that tanks didn't fight tanks. Their idea was that tanks fought other things. Tank destroyers fight tanks. So that's the mentality. So it's not Patton himself. I know he's a colorful figure. We want to focus on him. It really was the just about everybody in the combat development establishment made the decision for the Sherman in favor of the Sherman, and also convinced the British to adopt the Sherman as the basis and stop developing their own heavier tanks. Or stop producing, not developing, but stop producing. Does that answer your question, sir? Yes, yes. Yeah. No, and again, I'm not defending the decision. I'm simply saying there was a pretty broad consensus, and that was their thinking. So thank you, sir. JD, if you can just choose folks. Yeah.
Yes, my question is technical, very, very much so. Regarding the M4 Sherman A3 model, 44, 45.
Yes.
Did that tank have fire on the go, gyro stabilization system on it? Number two, if the tank is not running, the engine is shut off, is there an auxiliary power unit in that to operate to traverse the elevation of the main gun?
Okay, I'm going to actually ask you to talk to this gentleman. We spoke, yeah. Yeah. So no. I will tell you a secret. I am not an expert in armor. Right? I'm an historian, and when I write books, it's not because I know something I want to tell. It's because I want to find out something. Again, listen quietly, the shelves are groaning, the books are out there. Look at, Steve Zeliga has written some incredible books. Mr. Honeycutt has written an incredible book on the Sherman. Wonderful books, really expensive, but if you can find them, the answer is there.
Question, the German tank that was the most successful early in the war was actually not a German design, it was a Czech design that they inherited, well, stole.
Yes, yeah.
So how was that created? Because Czechoslovakia didn't even exist as a country at the end of it was created at the end of World War I.
Well, you know how I talked about before World War I, the most modern army in the world is out of Belgium? In the 1930s, the most modern army in the world is out of Czechoslovakia. They have an incredible, Czechoslovakia, when it's formed in 1919, inherits 2/3 of the military-industrial capacity of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Right? Austro-Hungary had 3 major arms-building centers: Škoda, Brno, and Steyr. Austria gets Steyr, Brno, and Škoda go to Czechoslovakia. And there is, for a number of reasons, including the Smoot-Hawley tariff, a great industrial boom in Czechoslovakia in the late 20s and 30s. And they also realize they have a small army with powerful neighbors. Remember, they don't only have to defend themselves against the Germans, but also against the Poles. And so they got very good very quick. If a really good reading on this is go to the U.S. Army attaché reports. The people who are visiting the Czech Army in the 1930s, they're really impressed. So yes, the T-35 and the T-38 were probably the best tanks in the German inventory in 1940-41. Czech design and Czech built.
Italians, since you're talking about the 30s, and
Yes.
I really don't know, but when they attacked Ethiopia, were they using tanks?
They were using some tanks and armored cars.
Easily defeated.
Yes. Though. Yeah. I'm not sure the tanks play a key role. The Italian tanks in the 30s are very, very light. They're essentially they're Bren carriers. They're Cardin Lloyd, open top, 2-man, barely armored, and carry a light machine gun. So they're very, very, very light. And it's been argued that one of the reasons that Italy does so poorly in World War II is because they invest so heavily in these super light tanks early on in the 20s and early 30s. And when the other countries start building, they've already used all the resources, and they have a fleet of obsolete weapons. So, but I suspect the Italians would have won the Abyssinian campaign even without tanks. Yes. Yes.
Thank you. As part of the promotional material for your lecture today, there was a statement in there that said that you considered the tank to be an obsolete weapon.
Oh no, this is not true.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, no. The last line of the book, not counting index and stuff, is the age of the tank is over. The age of tanks has begun. I think that the age in which the main battle tank, in a sense, it never dominated in the way we imagine it. But I think that if you look at the vehicles we're using in Afghanistan right now, things like the MRAP, hey, it's a tank. It's not a main battle tank, but armor, powerful engine, looks like a tank to me. And anybody prior to 1950 would have called it a tank. So let's call it a tank. That's my point. No, I'm not arguing. I am not arguing the tank's obsolete. Quite the opposite. One of the reasons, I think it's something we need to be thinking about seriously for a long time to come.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Quick points before we thank our speaker and a couple of announcements. The first is, And by the way, Bruce will be available to answer more questions afterwards, and he'll be signing. You can purchase a copy of his book at the table on the left and then get him to sign it on the right. And his fundamental argument, there's a twofold argument to his extremely well-written book that I think most of you that are asking questions will enjoy reading. And it's twofold. The first is that the development of tanks is not Whig history, that it's been iterative in response to a lot of different situations around the world, and some of the trails died out. And those trails are informative. And then the second piece of it is that the tank can't be understood except embodied in the organization of which it's designed. And the Germans were very good at that, and the Americans became very good at that. And that helps us understand and evaluate the gentleman's question back here. It's not a matter of comparing one tank against another. It's one tank within its organization and how it was intended to fight against another tank in its organization. And while I'm on that note, thank you, sir, for your service in World War II and your landing at Normandy. And let's give him a These issues are with us. With the defense cutbacks after we came out of Iraq, the Army canceled a program it's been working on for 20 years, and that's called the Future Combat System. And a Future Combat System was supposed to be a family of related armored vehicles modularly designed so that the same basic chassis could provide artillery, air defense, main battle tanks, armored infantry, and all that sort of thing. Too expensive, off the table, can't afford it, and so there is a trail that's even discussed in Bruce's book that for the moment has died out in the thinking of the United States because we can't afford it. In our 1st Infantry Division, we've deployed the brigade combat teams of the 1st Infantry Division are of two types: infantry, which are walking, and heavy, which are tanks and Bradley armored fighting vehicles. All of them have been deployed almost solely to Iraq and Afghanistan as infantry. And now that we're coming out, we're out of Iraq and we're starting to come out of Afghanistan, the 1st Infantry Division has to retool those two heavy brigades to rethink in terms of armor, because they have not been employed in that manner for 10 years. And that's not to say we haven't deployed tanks to those two theaters. So the point of all this is these issues are very much with the United States Army today. They are very much part of the discussion over defense priorities today, and a look at Bruce's well-constructed book will inform you a great deal. Couple of quick announcements. Our Legionnaires are in the back in the lobby collecting for the Midwest Shelter for Homeless Veterans in Wheaton, a wonderful 501c3 nonprofit organization that does great work. Got some spare change, drop it in the red, white, and blue mailbox. Friday, May 4th, Saturday, May 5th, we're hosting a reunion here for one rifle company of the 1st Division from Vietnam, Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 18th Infantry, Dogface, Swamp Rats. They call themselves a number of things. But three of the events of that reunion are open to the public. Both of them are panel discussions of a book. We're releasing a book of their memoirs called Dogface Charlie. That's on Friday. And then on Saturday, we've got a panel discussion by 3 authors who have written on the war in Vietnam. They are Jim Shelton, who we've published his memoir of the Battle of Ong Thon in 1967, in October 1967. Joan Kotcher, who wrote the book Don't It Dolly. It's a memoir of her service with the 1st Division in Vietnam as a Red Cross volunteer. And finally, Joe Galloway, who many of you know is the co-author of We Were Soldiers Once and Young, and We Are Soldiers Still with General Hal Moore. General Moore, some of you may know, is not in good health. He's very elderly and unable to travel and was not able to accept our invitation. You saw the big pictures of the Bill Malden cartoons in the lobby. Our exhibit opens here on Armed Forces Day, May 19th. It's going to be a terrific exhibit. It's Bill Malden and the GI experience in World War II. I hope, sir, that you'll come to that and tell us if we got it right. But Bill Malden is a very famous American cartoonist, and we're going to be exhibiting his works and then relating them to some of the 1st Division stories and artifacts that we have here. And our next date with history is June 6th, the first Wednesday in June, very famous date. Todd DiGastino will be speaking, and he is the biographer of Bill Malden, and he'll be talking about Bill Malden's service as a soldier and a cartoonist in World War II, so I hope you come to that. So that's a lot of stuff. We're delighted to have you here. Thanks for coming. We're going to stick around. The books are for sale. And Bruce, we're cheap date. We have a very small token of our appreciation, an environmentally correct water bottle with the crest of the 1st Division Museum at Cantini there, and you'll never get it mixed up with anybody else's because yours is the big red one. Thanks so much.